This presentation will focus on what's called spiral dynamics, the brainchild of my late friend, Professor Claire W. Graves, who I met many, many years ago and decided that I would spend the rest of my life looking at this marvelous concept because it had in it the codes of humanity. By that I mean how humanity makes decisions in order to solve the existence problems. And so ever since that time, I have been chronicling this conceptual system. And I've just been listening to the debate today from Washington about the future of President Trump and other issues. And it's so clear that the real issues are not about what anybody's talking about. Like when I deal with the race issue, I make the point, it's not about race or skin color. It's about value systems that lurks behind particular worldviews. And if we want to understand racial balance or gaps, we have to get beyond the surface and we have to begin to identify what you see here, the basic codes, value systems, which are hidden from us and certainly from Washington, D.C., because so much of the issue today is about U.S. and Russia relationships. I'm very amused that I've figured out what's really going on here because I spent time in Russia, 5 trips, and I know precisely the development in Russia. And it's not at all about what they are debating, because there's a simultaneous development in Russia using spiral dynamics. And that's what's confusing everybody. And it would take me about 30 minutes to lay out the whole future of US-Russia relationship, because I found that Russians that we dealt with for years are very much like us and are searching for some of the same solutions that we are searching for. And that gives a simonicity and a confusion that means Russia is intervening. Russia is trying to learn from us. And if we could wake up and see that, we could deal with what I think is the reason why I'm doing this. I promised Claire W. Graves that I would address 3 issues. 1, I wanted to help dismantle apartheid. And I made 65 trips to South Africa, working with Nelson Mandela and Chief Minister Buthelezi and many others in order to reframe the issues out of apartheid. And it would have been very successful, as in the movie Invictus that tracked the Springbok rugby team in the World Cup in 1995. And it was clear to me that as Mandela began to endorse the Springbok, he was creating national unity because that would be necessary just after he was elected. So what's lurking behind all of these global issues is something that we are just now discovering. And what you see in this seminal work of Professor Graves, and in the 50 years where I've been working here in Denton, Texas, on this conceptual model, and many others are working with me, especially Saeed and Thomas, to begin to find applications. And obviously I don't have time to map out the whole conceptual system. When we do our 6-day training programs, both in EFW and elsewhere, then we're able to produce a complex version of spiral dynamics. And I invite those of you interested to join with us. Now, basically what's happening today in Washington, conflict between the progressive, which is the sixth and fifth value system, the green and the orange, who are competing with the blue and the yellow. That is exactly what's going on. I have analyzed carefully President Trump since he first appeared. I had never met the man or his team or his family, but my wife and I both were impressed by the clarity, by his political skill, knowing he's not a diplomat. So he would be rough. He would be an example of a sow's ear trying to be a silk purse. And in his entry into politics, he wouldn't have the normal diplomatic skills. Thank God. Because as the last election emerged, it was clear to us that both parties were wrong, were on the wrong track, only partial. And because of that, something new and different. Now, I didn't choose for that to be Donald Trump, but it was because he had the political negotiating skills and the autocratic nature, both characteristic of the seventh code that we were extremely important to develop our country. And the fact that he has caught so much flack, so many people attacked him. So who's afraid of what and why? And what was the nature of that polarization and demonization that occurred in virtually every discipline and shows on our TV screens right now? And it's simply that we are unable to understand why he appeared as he did. And we should be thankful that he did, because we needed that kind of reshuffling of everything. And in spite of what he has done and his family, who suffered great ordeals because of it, so many so-called critics that we've not been able to appreciate the contribution that he has made. Maybe we never will. But the task at hand is about value systems, level development. And as you can see here from the screen, the global order, the eighth code, the integrated self, the yellow code, the egalitarian order, the sixth code. That's why it's green. And so many of these freshmen talk about a sensitive green world without realizing that's not the final stage. At the fifth level, we have the westernization, the ability to manipulate, to find power and reason in the world, and the capability for us to solve very complex issues. At the fourth level is the absolute order. And we've had very ugly attempts in this country, as we even attacked policemen by pouring water on their heads because we've lost any sense of an absolute order. At the third level is a powerful self that we often see in sports and in geopolitics, heroic, impulsive, exploitative, and tribal order. Then that is simply how we understand kinship and family and so forth. So what I'm trying to say, from the complexity of geopolitics to the simple rearing of children, we have found the code that is necessary for us to survive and flourish as humans. That's why we're talking about humanity's approach. Survival sense, kin spirits, power God, truth force, strive drive in orange, and human bond in green. Then there's yellow, and then there will be turquoise. So what Claire Grace found was It's a never-ending quest. As human nature becomes more complex, it requires greater complexity in our political, religious, educational operation. So the point that I'm trying to make with you is while I was not able to make this particular trip, that if you spend the time understanding value systems, then you'll be amazed at how this can unlock some of the most difficult problems that we confront as a human species. And so I've been, in my 50 years of career, committing myself to understand the genius of Claire W. Graves, and it's embedded in the spiral dynamics framework. And the new book, Spiral Dynamics in Action, is the official title of the concept that we are using. And certainly one can see in the work of Thomas, as well as Said, field applications of this powerful system. So I hope to invite you then to explore it more carefully. It is very complex, but so is human nature. And if we embrace a very simplistic system, that's what we get. But if you listen to Said talk about financial systems and his entire life as a builder, as a financial genius, has demonstrated the power of that system. And his wife, Elza Malouf, who has worked with us in the West Bank, in Israel, Palestine, has added a human dynamic to this whole approach. So these are codes: egalitarianism, progress in orange, purpose in blue, dominance in red, bonding in purple, and survival, the first code. So our entire attempt has been, from my side, when I first met Claire Grace, was to continue the documentation, and you'll find that in the book, Spiral Dynamics in Action. You'll see very specific kinds of applications in research for those of you who are interested in that. So we invite you then to join with us in understanding the master code. So thank you very much for listening. I live in Denton, Texas. I'm interested to communicate as far as I can, and I hope that maybe we can engage in conversation about this. So the idea of a master code is not a dominant system. It's a process. It's a means whereby human nature figures out what to do. So the code then is in how we put together the particular capacities. It's neither left wing or right wing or conservative or liberal. It's simply the process of putting together the unique blend of systems that match the people and their needs. So we always begin with who are the people, what are they doing, how can we help them do that better, then how, having done that, it will trigger the next system. And so it's a never-ending quest that characterizes the kind of work that we have done. So I certainly want to thank Said and Thomas for being there this week. And I hope maybe to see some of you in a future presentation.
Great, thank you, Don. This was wonderful. So, good morning, everyone. my work revolves around what Dr. Beck and Dr. Graves have created over the last 6 decades or so, and applying it to the field of macroeconomics. So what you're going to hear from me in the next 20 or 25 minutes or so is the application of the value systems framework, those spiral dynamics framework, to the field of economics. And it's not the other way around. Spiral dynamics at one point was considered the most comprehensive theory that explains everything. While the field of economics, unfortunately, has remained proprietary, and as long as it continues to externalize the cost of its operations, it will unfortunately remain on the lower level of consciousness on the spiral. Having said that, I want to give you a bit of a primer on the kind of work I do. What you see in front of you is a spiral that represents global productive output, the widest measure of economic activity. But instead of it being organized by country, it is organized by value system. So what you see at the first level is the survivalistic values. There is no economic system there. The level you see above that is that tribalistic value systems that is primarily represented by agricultural output, simple trade and production. That system today represents 2 to 3% of total global GDP. The system above that is that of heroic and egocentric values. At the national level, any country that derives more than 50% of its GDP from natural resources has failed to emerge out of that egocentric state of existence. That system today represents 4 to 7% of total global GDP. The system above that is the blue system of central planning and production. The only major global economy in that system today is China. It represents 14 to 17% of global output. The system above that is where the West has been for the last 200 years. The values of the Enlightenment, the values of scientific and strategic thinking, and oftentimes that strategic thinking becomes very manipulative. That system today represents the lion's share of global output, 50 to 55%. The system above that is the one of humanitarian and egalitarian values that started emerging in the United States in a major way in the early 90s. It prefers human and community capital over financial capital. That system today represents 10 to 12% of global output. Now, the system above that is what Don talked about, the seventh code. These are the second tier values. This is when you see the total big picture of humanity on Earth. I still hold a lot of promise for the knowledge economy to be a part of that system. Unfortunately, due to the financialization infrastructure that we have in place today, the potential of the knowledge economy has been hindered. But I'm still very optimistic about its movement to the future since it's a really highly functional system. The other group of entities that belong in that system are members of the conscious capitalism movement that was established by John Mackey, who is the founder and CEO of Whole Foods. By the way, Whole Foods used spiral dynamics in all their management philosophies up, of course, until the time they were taken over by Amazon, which is an entire algorithmic operation of the fifth level system. And the top system there, the global order, the turquoise system that Don mentioned, which is the last known level of values uncovered by Dr. Graves, unfortunately, that system is appearing not out of conscious evolution of our economic practices, rather out of our necessity to do something about climate change. Those are regenerative values. They account for less than 1% of the total global GDP. It's a very, that system is in its very embryonic stage. There are less than 1% of the global population today that thinks in turquoise terms. And I think they're all here. So, So the little boxes that you see on every level that have the percentages in them, if you look at the first 5 levels on there, those represent pretty much every form of capital that we have available to us today, okay? When we move to the second tier of values, when we take that momentous leap, we do not create additional forms of capital. We align the existing forms of capital. So the yellow system aligns it on to a sustainability trajectory that sees the damage that we have done to the planet over the last few hundred years. I think Don had a perfect code that stayed in my mind from 10, 12 years ago about how to describe the second tier. The yellow system stitches together a wounded world. The turquoise system comes in and applies the healing ointment. So we will spend a lot of time in the yellow system making the lower systems more sustainable or beholden to better values of themselves. And then comes in the regenerative system that distributes the values of the yellow system to the lowest possible hold-on that exists. All right, so we all have heard of economic cycles. We've heard of business cycles. In spiral dynamics, we have value system cycles. And when you apply it to economics, we get what I call Meme-nomic cycles. And what I've uncovered in my research is that the United States has been through 3 different cycles. The red system of egocentric and heroic values, I call the fiefdoms of power cycle. This is when a handful of men were responsible for developing the economy the way we knew it. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the JP Morgans of the world. The values of that system collapsed under their own weight into the Great Depression, and out of the ashes of that system rose a new communal psychosocial economic system. Remember the spiral swings from one of the very first slides that were on Dr. Beck's presentation. The spiral swings between individualistic psychosocial systems and communal psychosocial systems. So with the collapse of the first cycle, you began to see the rise of the new communal cycle. And that I call the patriotic prosperity cycle. It is more known as the New Deal, that gave us the infrastructure that we know today, that gave us Bretton Woods, that gave us the institutions that we still cherish and use to this day. But in its very nature, if you remember the organizational structure of the blue system, it's very rigid. So as it passed its growth and maturity state, it became very cumbersome and bureaucratic. It crashed under its own weight in the late 70s, and out of its ashes rose a new and supposedly higher level values of the orange system, another individualistic system that uses science and research and development. I call that system the only money matters cycle. I borrowed that from our friend Milton Friedman from the Chicago School. So with all due respect to the folks that are here from the Chicago School, that system ushered in. So at his inaugural address, Ronald Reagan announces that government is the enemy of business. And with that, he unleashed the unbelievable power of the orange system. It created so much wealth, it created so much opportunity that Secretary Summers talked about Monday night, but it also got into the unhealthy expression of itself. And to the point where in 2008, it almost cost the collapse of global economic order. Out of the ashes of that system, although we've saved it, it's still going through its decline phases and trying to reinterpret itself, but only with limited values that are still available to it. But out of the ashes of that bailout rose the new system. And this is the green system that Don talked about. This is the egalitarian system, which we are experiencing in a substantive way as it comes to us through the digital age. So with the onset of the internet, the early 1990s, the ubiquity of the green system has been available to everybody in the world. It is the democratization of information and resources. But a word of caution for you who are emerging into the green system. Democratization, as good as it is, it has an ugly side as well, and we will talk about that in the next system. So since the financial crises, investment in green tech, investment in green enterprise, things that are proprietary to the green value system has gone up 10 to 15 times. So if there's a reason for optimism, it is that. So as you look at this and say, wow, we're really emerging into more equitable economic values, you sort of take a look at that economic stack that determines where the majority of the values of our economic system is, and it is still pretty much determined by the only money matters value. It's still being determined by the financialization expression of the capitalist system. And that can't go on much longer if we are going to move up to the second tier of values, to the seventh level system. So here's an example of what the seventh level does. As Don said, it's a functional system that looks to align and integrate the entire first tier onto a healthy trajectory, onto a sustainability trajectory through its own values that are lean, that are not tied to an ideology. They're more interested in the actual functioning of the system than the actual commitment to one particular ideology over the other. It takes the lower systems and really makes them beholden to a better expression of themselves. So it goes into the red element in culture and says, look, we need your courage, we need your bravery and risk-taking, but we don't need you to be undermining underground activities that threaten the global economy. It goes to the blue system and says, we need your resilience in building institutions, in building infrastructure, but we don't need your hulking bureaucracy to the point that it affects the innovation of the orange system. It also goes into the orange system and it says, we love your genius in research and development. We love your genius in scientific discovery. We love your work with algorithms. But those activities cannot cause the threat that they caused in 2008, in a sense, being a major threat that can collapse the global economy again. So it aligns these values on a trajectory towards the big image of what life on Earth would look like under an economy driven by the values of the seventh level system. And this slide here, I promise you this is I don't know if people in the back can see that, but I'll gladly send whoever would like a copy of this presentation, I'll gladly send you a copy of it if you just email me. Most of these I outlined in my book. My book has been out 6 years, and what I've added on some of the bullet points there is what a turquoise system would do, in addition to what a yellow system would do, simply because to me, climate change has become undeniable, okay? So at the heart of any yellow system that you want to build, any system that is a thrivable, sustainable system in the long term, you must have a government designed from the seventh level of values. We have no government. With Reagan's declaration of government being the enemy of business, we have systemically deregulated every aspect of our economy to the point that bankers dictate to us how life is going to be. And those are entirely toxic values of the orange system that must disappear. And so you start first and foremost with building a resilient government. I was sharing my ideas on who is a seventh level thinker in Washington today, and the person I shared it with says, if you elect that person, we'll become another Venezuela. But I will still say it again, one of the brightest representatives of systems thinking in government today is Elizabeth Warren. We need about 1,000 Elizabeth Warrens at every level of government, at every branch of government, so we can ascend to that system before it's too late. Most of the items on there, again, are just how to align the different segments of the economy, moving the digital economy to big picture views and second-tier values. To me, data is a representative of all the lower systems. They're just confused and unstructured. You move data to information, it becomes green, but it's still vulnerable to wildcards and predatory opportunist individuals. Information gets shaped into knowledge that rebuilds what was removed from information when it was in physical form before it was transformed to digital form. And this is something important that I will bring up again for you in the audience who are interested in knowing more about the future of the digital currency. Information needs to move from its green state to its structured knowledge state in the yellow system. And it really needs to develop or functionalize its bits and bytes to root out predatory behavior, to rule out any wild agents that might destabilize it. As that system stabilizes, it hands it over to the turquoise system, which is a state of wisdom. In turquoise, technology is servant to the human. And so there will be a return of the human being in charge of all technology, but that human needs to be informed by the values of the 8th level system. Thank you. We need a yellow financial system. Money must remain a function of productive output. We've seen what notional value has done to our economy in 2008. It needs to return. This is a blue function, and a blue function designed from the 7th level system. It is a government function. It is an institutional function. It needs to return to that. Cometh the time, cometh the currency. Cryptocurrency is here to stay, folks. I don't share a lot of the views that were skeptical about the future of it. Today, it is still in its embryonic state, and let me explain to you what that means. If you're someone who is fed up with the unfairness of the centralized system that we have in place today, and again, the green system is where hierarchy of all kind comes to die. So if you're tired of the centralized process in which currency is done, you want to disrupt it, you want to decentralize it, you want to democratize it. And as noble as that is, what you need to do in parallel is that you need to create the virtual institution that have protected that system from predatory values of the red system and the exploitive red system. If you don't do that in the virtual world, your creation is doomed. And I think that's why there's so much speculation about it. That's why the Treasury Secretary does not want to support anything that Facebook creates. It is because it is still in that embryonic green stage of existence, and it needs to move to the yellow system where it creates its own systems that guard it against exploitation. Look at what's happening with Bitcoin. 50% of its users use it for underground activities. 80% who use it as a currency use it to trade it. Compared to the dollar, less than 1% of the dollar is traded as a currency in everyday activity. So it needs to move to values that are closer to that. Okay? Let's see. Empowering the distributed intelligence model of the 4th Industrial Revolution. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Redefining corporate sustainability. The maturation of the digital economy into the wisdom state, we talked about that earlier. Disrupt responsibly, that's what I mean. Don't think that a decentralized system can stand on its own without protections. Adopting the founder CEO ethic. What I found in my research is that founder CEOs have an emotional attachment to their creation. They treat their corporations and their employees as their own children. So they generally have a far longer view of what their creations are. Because of that, they tend to look at things generationally instead of what Wall Street demands quarterly. They tend to spend a lot more time on research and development. They tend to spend a lot more time on developing the human capacity of their own people, and they spend a lot more money on the physical plants, the offices, the warehouses, the production facilities, and so forth. Okay, adopting the stakeholder model of the conscious capitalism movement. Don didn't get a chance to talk about that. The conscious capitalism movement is based on the 5 Ps model of the 7th level system. People, profit, planet, process, and purpose, covering every value system from the blue system up all the way to the yellow system, but only in the healthiest expression. Transparency makes that process a lot easier. Whole Foods, before Amazon took it over, I don't know what they're doing now, but before Amazon took it over, everybody at Whole Foods knew what everybody else made. And so that kind of transparency just opens up the entire dynamic for employees to have a healthier, more competitive, but friendly environment at work. That really, you don't need to buy my book anymore. All right. So As we mentioned earlier, the disruption of business as usual has begun, and it is ugly and it is chaotic. So what we're talking about now is our emergence into the 6th level system and beyond, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Green is where hierarchy comes to die. So all the chaos that you see around you today, from the tribalization, from the radicalization, from people who you thought are not electable before, all that is because we have emerged into the green system, and we have emerged into it in such a ubiquitous way through the internet that it is disrupting and making things chaotic at an exponential rate. This could be good and it also could be bad, but I want to emphasize the good part is that it's accelerating the emergence of our values into the next system, okay? So when I first showed this slide to my presentation to Galia, and the only comment she had was about this slide, and at the time it was all men that I had on it, and she said, "Why don't you have any women on there?" And I was so tempted to say, well, I just wanted to show the limitations of the male ego, but then I decided to take out the last 3 at the bottom and insert these codes just to give you an idea of how the change in thinking takes place when you start thinking in second tier. So the 3rd from the bottom there is code is from David Korten, who's a Harvard economist who worked most of his career in Africa. He's had a chance to objectively see the capitalist system from the outside. Capitalism has defeated communism. It is now well on its way to defeating democracy. What that means in spiral dynamics, if you are holden to an ideology to the death, that ideology will eventually cause the crumbling of the very institutions that made it alive, okay? That code is from 15 years ago. So look at what's happening with our democracy today. The second one is from Len Ostrom, who in my opinion is really the only economist in the 8th level system, or was the only economist in the 8th level system. We're locked into a system that compels growth without limit. In a world that is limited, ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Management of the commons is the single most important issue facing humanity. If we screw that one up, you can kiss your portfolio goodbye. And the last code on there is what a second-tier economist would say. Instead of championing the rise and fall of a dogma and ideology, we should place their best practices into a functional, sustainable, regenerative flow so a full understanding of humanity can prevail on a planet with limited resources. Okay, well, I started talking about this disruption before I changed the order of the slides, and I apologize for that. This is a slide that we started talking about the disruption or ascent into the green system and beyond. The current disruption is already beginning to take place. It remains at an embryonic stage, but we can at least get an idea of what it's going to look like. The universally educated human being is the smallest holon. It is a holonic system where the largest structure is almost identical to the smallest unit of function with a lot more flexibility to perform. That is a code from Peter Drucker, who's the modern-day father of management theory. He basically said that the capitalist system's worst enemy is a universally educated human being. All the remaining codes on there, you can tell, are in exact opposite of the values of the orange system. The current system is collaborative, nonlinear, and highly complex. Orange is everything but that. It is secretive, it is somewhat linear, and it is not that complex. So the disruption has begun, and this is not going to be a 4th industrial revolution, or, well, it can be, but I call it the infodustrial evolution. So any second-tier economist would think in the terms of taking best practices from the industrial age of the last 200 years, combine them with the last 50 years of the information age to create a system that looks like something like this. The automation of utility, the end of quantifiable work. I'm sure many of you here have seen the research done by Cambridge University from a couple of years ago that says if your work is quantifiable, it will disappear in the next 2 decades. Okay? It's a scary thought. They're not going for the working class anymore. The digital economy is going to begin to wipe out the middle class, you and me. Okay? A smart government designed from the 7th level would anticipate this coming and would begin working on social safety net to minimize the effect on each and every family. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of government in place. It should have started a few years before the economic crash, but unfortunately, there is no government today that can think from those second-tier values. Maturation of the network blue, so we're talking about here the presence of institutions in the digital age, so the movement of regulation from the actual physical institutions that housed it to structures that house it in the ether. So we're talking about moving cryptocurrency from its initial experiment with Bitcoin on to what it needs to become, as we talked about earlier. It needs to continue preserving the guardians that keep out the predatory values. Blockchain is entry stage yellow. It is entry in that 7th level system in the sense that it verifies the chain of custody of the transactions. In addition to that, what blockchain needs to do is verify the chain of custody of who owns it and who trades it. You need to leave trading of the currency to a minimum as much as possible. You need to make absolutely sure, in order for it to gain legitimacy, you need to make absolutely sure that it is not the underground economy that's using the currency. Right? Finally, wise governance. It is decentralized but never autonomous. There are a lot of functions in government that could be made into an algorithm and gotten rid of. But in the end, it is wise people who are informed by the second tier of values that are in touch with what each and every one of us needs to be happy and well-adjusted. Okay, I want to zoom out a little bit now and talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, so the economics of the Anthropocene. Don mentioned the momentous leap. I talked about a little bit about the momentous leap. Here's you can feel the texture of what we need to move to. So this is more like a from what to what type of code, okay? So this is directly from Graves. A chasm of unbelievable depth of meaning is crossed. It is the gap between getting and giving, taking and contributing, destroying and constructing. It is the gap between deficiency or deficit motivation and growth and abundance motivation. It is the gap between similarity to animals and dissimilarity to animals, because only man is possessed with a future orientation. Now, the graph that you see on there is from Graves' original research. And so what he uncovered, and this goes back to the late 60s, what he uncovered is that not only people emerge in value systems in states and stages, but that also every 6th level of values contain a tier. And as we move from one tier to the other, the theme of every value system repeats in the next tier, but at an exponentially higher level. So for example, the AN value that you see on here, this is the beige survivalistic value, but in the first tier, so in the first grouping of 6 levels, that is the survival of man in the jungle. As it reappears in the next system, we're talking about the yellow system now, the A1N1. As it appears in that system, it is still, the theme is still survival, but it's no longer survival of the individual. It is a survival of the species, it's the survival of the planet. Similarly with the tribalistic values, the BO system in the first group represents tribal life at the local level. B101 is tribal living at the global level. So it takes advantage of everything that we learned in the first year, including what the yellow system has done, and begins to distribute that intelligence to the lowest unit possible in the whole lot. That's what global order that is ecologically aligned looks like. So, when this research was done in the late 60s and early 70s, people have asked me, well, great, how does that inform climate change? Well, and this is the last slide. So here's how we apply spiral dynamics to climate change. So far, we have been, as a humanity, we've been resolving the problems of existence in the first tier, basically from trying to deal with the decline of the orange system and the rise of the green system. But while we're doing that, we keep externalizing the cost of our economic activity to the environment. And we have done that so much that we have triggered the problems of existence in the turquoise system. So and Don didn't get a chance to explain that, the key element that makes the model dynamic is that we're presented with a certain set of problems in the physical world, and as we go out to solve them in the physical world, our adaptive intelligence to solve that specific problem is triggered in our neurology and psychology. Okay, so in our myopic view of what economics is, we have triggered the problems of the turquoise system that if you look at the top line there that requires, so we triggered the problems of the B1 in the B101 system, but it requires the O1 level of intelligence to solve it. Okay, we have less than 1% of people who think in terms of ecological alignment and how to design it. Look at the gap that we have. We are somewhere between the intelligence needed to activate the egalitarian system and the O1 system. This is the gap. If you look at the horizontal difference, that's the chasm. We are looking at having to skip what would amount to decades, if not centuries, of normal cultural evolution that is usually messy, where the best ideas survive and move forward. We're not going to have time to do that. So you'd say, well, what do we do? For the kids who are cutting classes on Friday, I would recommend that they cut classes all week, that they get their teachers and their parents to do the same. Do everything you can possibly can to awaken the arrested state that our politicians or our institutions are in. Our institutions need to evolve exponentially to deal with this issue. Our universities should stop producing so many MBAs and start focusing on producing climate scientists. So I want to conclude with the last part of Dr. Graves' code from the previous slide, which says, we are the only humanity with a future orientation. We'd better start thinking from that future that is the O1 intelligence system. We'd better start thinking and acting from that, or we can guess this only home that we've known, we can kiss it goodbye. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Mihaela Ulieru, and actually I'm using the Holonic system since 25 years, I think, in some work, mainly, of course, on manufacturing and other stuff, but now going up into organic governance. And thank you for this presentation. Amazing. I'm learning now about your system, but not only now, of course, I read the book and so on, but so here is clear that it illustrates the gap. And looking around, and even not around only, what about if we all would be climate scientists? I do not think this is the only solution. So I would like to ask you, how can we actually apply this framework in like, if you can give a simple example, the Amazon or something, anything. Should we return to tribal values? What should we actually do? Or how can we apply the framework beyond all of us needing to become data scientists?
Yeah, that was just a suggestion. We don't need as many MBAs as we had to a financial world that's full of algorithms. You know, it's going to put the smartest people out of business to begin with anyway. But the idea that we need to really have more predictive models on how climate is changing. It's changing at exponential levels. And when you hear news that say, we were surprised that the North Pole ice is melting 4 times faster than it should, this really shouldn't have been news to us.
No, I understand that. Sorry to interrupt. But my question is how to apply it really, like now, besides just observing and so what else?
Technology has always been a catalyst that made the movement up the spiral a lot easier and quicker. So I will focus on technologies like Howard Bloom, if he's in the audience. Howard and I had a conversation about this a couple nights ago. There are technologies that can help us move to that. Unfortunately, again, the technology gap is way behind. An MIT science lab report came out a few weeks ago that says we still don't have any idea of what the technology looks like that needs to get rid of about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide we're creating today. I think much of the holonic manufacturing that you talked about, much of that needs to manifest. We need to, like Al Gore says, the idea of carbon neutrality is a non-starter anymore. So we need to move beyond carbon neutrality. We need to move to regenerative activities. Unfortunately, our institutions are not geared to that, and my fear is that there will be a major global catastrophe that will force us into action, like the disappearance of habitable land in a subcontinent somewhere, and something, things along these lines. The disappearance of farmland in Middle America. Those are the kind of things that would trigger, if not the politicians, at least the citizens to rise up and say, get out of office, I need someone who knows how to address this. Understood. I'll hand the microphone over to Thomas, who should have been really an integral part of this. Maybe as a technologist, he'll have the answer that you're looking for.
As a technologist, I guess, maybe I have the answer, but I probably don't. But the biggest thing is this framework is really a framework about communicating to people who, even though they may speak your same language, they don't speak your same language. And the beautiful thing that everyone has here is their own beauty. And even though you may not be a climatologist or whatnot, you may be an artist, you can go to these indigenous communities and share their language in a way that can reach a more, I guess, egalitarian or even more orange system. One of the beautiful things is I was with some Toltec once, and they were explaining to me in Mexico City about this one mountain, just like this one, where 3 essentially air currents or 3 weather systems came in, and they were trying to explain that they shouldn't remove this mountain, but they were explaining it in stories instead of science. And so even though you may not be a climatologist, you can do your part and going and explaining things to these different people. So it's more than just a framework of technology, these different types of technologies. It's also a language. And the biggest thing that we have to remember about language is a metaphor for an idea. It is not the idea itself. And so each and every one of you has a power to explain things in your own way.
The only thing I'd want to add to that is that keep in mind that every value system brings along its own what we call value system attractors. So it brings along its own appropriate level of psychological development, sociological development, neurological development, technological development, philosophy, and so forth. Those are general category memes that self-organize around the emergence of every system. So I hope that answers some of the other areas that weren't covered. Is that with this system, with the rush of this system needing to be made manifest, a lot of other values will show up with it as well.
Thank you again, Dr. Dawlabani, for coming and giving us that rundown. Thomas, you actually set me up very well there.
I'm a graduate school dropout, so don't call me Dr. Dawlabani.
My name's Niall Jane. I actually work in a communications firm, so I think a lot about how to distill very complex ideas in a way that are accessible to people. And as someone who went to all my classes. Maybe I'm not helpful in this sense, but I was wondering in terms of the turquoise system, what an educational model actually looks like. How do you bring into the fold, masses of people who need to kind of think on this level and need to think on this level very quickly?
The urgency needs to be there, so I will empower a lot of people who are already thinking in that system to empower others in their peer group who might not be aware of the level of thinking that's needed in that system to begin to develop it. We have the necessary technology to be able to spread that everywhere we want, but unfortunately, when over 92% of the population is still lurking around first-tier values, and we're talking about, majority of that is from orange and below. It's going to take a lot of work. What we're missing is what we call a superordinate goal. Not everybody, not even in this gathering, believes that climate change is real. So multiply that and take it over across the globe, and you will see very people believing that that thing needs to be addressed. The red system and below, they don't even think a future that far. They're impulsive values. Which brings me back to the sad reality that the only way for us all to realize that this is a necessity is by a major tragedy to happen. Superordinate goals don't rise on their own. There needs to be a superordinate threat.
So just a quick one to respond to that. And that was a beautiful question. Education is a big passion of mine. The root word of education, which means to educe, which means to draw forth from within. And a beautiful thing that I explained before is that we're really looking for the beauty of each of these systems. So regardless of where people are at, what is their beauty? What are they good at? And a turquoise system looks to create a whole human who both mentally, spiritually, and emotionally is able to attack the challenges of his life conditions. And these superordinate goals that we speak of, they can be an exponential threat, but it also can be something like going to the moon. We saw that with JFK when he famously gave his moonshot project that pushed everybody to go towards the moon.
Hi, I'm Bahia Robinson, VC Include. So we were talking about, a lot of things are in my mind right now. One is we're talking about people and planet, right? And you kind of led with the climate change piece, but I'm wondering around values and around gender equality, like how do those pieces in terms of values play into this? Equity, when you talked about the Toltec, like how do you create a system where people listen and actually respect and trust that wisdom, and then make either recommendations or decisions or pivot based on understanding. If that mountain goes down, it's not just about the mountain itself. It's not just about the climate change itself as an idea. It's also about the values of understanding, respecting, trusting that particular tribe, or if we're creating this global tribal ecosystem, then how do we build in those values into this? I heard a little bit about it, but can you speak a little bit more?
Well, so the values of that system are as far from what could be conceived today from what we believe in as what we're, the things that we're attached to, the formations that we're attached to. This is what's called a distributed intelligence model. If you can envision how a Oh, no doubt. The interiority aspects of these would still need to evolve. We cannot get to second tier without being fully mature spiritual and psychological beings, and that will include the recognition of everything that's around us, from gender equality, from equal pay, from all that. What I really need the audience to keep in mind is, if you think of one of the most famous people in climate change. He was a philosopher as well as he was a climate scientist, a guy by the name James Lovelock. He says it will be a sad day for humanity to think that all life is about is human needs and human rights, while we ignore the rights and the needs of Gaia, of Mother Earth. And so, yes, it is a holonic structure where the smallest person has to be turquoise, as well as the largest, what Thierry Desjardins calls the noosphere, what our friend Howard Bloom, if he's still in the audience, calls the global brain. This is what we're dealing with. It is the global brain that is magnified at the global level, that is transcended all the way down to the smallest living unit. And so and that person has to be a whole person, otherwise we can't address these issues.